A dark, rainy night, a lonely bus ride, and passengers who aren't what they seem. You won't believe what happens when the bus driver's chilling stare reveals the true terror waiting ahead. Stay with me, because this ride is about to get worse. It was one of those nights when everything felt wrong, but you couldn't quite put your finger on what it was. The air was thick with moisture, and the sound of rain pelting the streets outside echoed like a heartbeat in the silence of the small town. Every drop was a reminder of the heaviness that clung to the world around you, but it wasn't the rain that made your skin crawl. It was the stillness, the kind of stillness that made you wonder if maybe the world outside had just stopped. You stood at the bus stop, pulling your jacket tighter around you as the wind bit through the fabric. The dim street lights flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. In the distance, you could hear the faint rumble of thunder, but it was so far away it seemed almost unreal. It was like the whole world was caught in some kind of time loop, stuck in a moment that never quite passed. You checked your watch, 11:45 p.m. The last bus should have come by 20 minutes ago. You'd been standing out here for far too long, and even though you'd told yourself it was stupid to wait, something about this night felt different, like something important was about to happen, and the rain was just the beginning of it. You sighed, rubbing your tired eyes, and glanced down the empty street. No one was around, not a soul in sight. It was just you, the rain, and the sound of the wind. Click. You froze. The sound of footsteps, faint at first, but unmistakable. They weren't yours. You turned your head slowly, heart starting to pound in your chest. There, just at the edge of the streetlight's glow, a figure appeared. A man, tall, dressed in a long, dark coat. He was standing still, just watching you. The air felt suddenly colder. You tried to shake it off. People did walk around at night, right? It was nothing, probably just someone on their way home. But the longer you stared at him, the more uncomfortable you became. There was something about the way he stood there, unmoving, that made your stomach twist. You quickly turned your gaze back to the street, desperately willing the bus to come. Another click. This time, the sound was louder, closer. You couldn't bring yourself to look at the man again. He hadn't moved, but you could feel his presence creeping closer. You knew it was ridiculous, but you couldn't shake the sensation that he was waiting for something. You swallowed hard, pulling your phone from your pocket to check the time again, as if doing so would make everything normal again. 11:47 p.m. This was getting absurd. The bus should have been here by now. Suddenly, headlights pierced the gloom of the street, cutting through the fog and the heavy rain. A bus, the last bus. It was coming. You let out a sigh of relief, but as it got closer, something caught your eye. It wasn't just the headlights that were strange. The bus itself, how could you describe it? It looked off. The front grille was unusually narrow, almost as if it had been redesigned by someone who had no idea what a bus was supposed to look like. The windows were fogged up, and the body of the bus was darker than it should have been, almost like it had been painted black and the rain was only making it harder to see. It didn't slow down as it approached. The headlights remained blinding, casting long shadows across the street as it came closer, as if the driver didn't see you standing there. The bus was speeding toward you too fast. You took a step back, heart in your throat. It was going to pass right by you. But then, at the last possible second, the bus screeched to a halt, the sound of the tires grinding against the wet pavement like nails on a chalkboard. The doors opened with an ominous hiss, and from the dim light inside, you could see the shadow of the driver sitting motionless behind the wheel, his face hidden in the dark. You didn't know what compelled you to step forward. Maybe it was the sheer exhaustion of waiting out here in the rain. Maybe it was the bizarre feeling that you had no choice but to get on. But you stepped up to the door, hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind you, and you took a moment to catch your breath. The interior of the bus was strange, dimly lit. The lights flickered overhead, casting unsettling shadows that made it feel as though the walls were closing in. There were only a few passengers on board. Most of them were asleep, or at least pretending to be, but there was something off about them. They were all sitting motionless, facing forward, their bodies unnaturally stiff. Not a single one of them moved as you passed by them to find a seat. You found one toward the back, next to a window. The rain splattered against the glass, creating a blurry view of the dark streets outside. The bus started moving again, and you glanced at the driver. His face was still obscured, but you could see his hands, gripping the wheel tightly. His knuckles were white, like he was holding on for dear life. He hadn't said a word since you boarded. You turned your attention to the other passengers, trying to make sense of the strange atmosphere in the bus. Something wasn't right. The air was thick, like it was charged with some kind of unspoken tension. There was a slight hum in the background, like the sound of the wheels on the wet asphalt, but beneath it, you could almost hear a faint whisper. It was so soft at first, you thought it was just your imagination. But then, it grew louder. You leaned in closer, straining to hear. The whisper wasn't in English, but it sounded like your name. You looked around at the other passengers. No one was looking at you. No one was moving, but you swore, deep down in your gut, that someone, or something, was speaking your name. This story seems to be getting scarier, doesn't it? If you want more stories like this, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. This helps create even more scary for you. The whispering continued. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was almost like a presence, like the air around you was thick with voices. The soft, unintelligible murmur grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakably close. It was coming from the seat next to you. You glanced quickly to your right, but the person who was sitting there, an older woman, dressed in a tattered coat, was still sitting rigidly, staring blankly ahead. Her eyes were glazed over, empty. For a second, your heart skipped a beat. Was it her? No, it couldn't have been. She hadn't moved. You turned back to the front, taking a deep breath. Maybe it was just your imagination. You hadn't slept in over 24 hours. The exhaustion was beginning to catch up with you, messing with your mind. You tried to focus on the rhythmic hum of the bus engine, the steady bump of the wheels against the road. But there it was again. Your name, clearer this time. David. You froze, feeling the blood drain from your face. The whisper had come from behind you. Slowly, you turned your head, trying to keep your breathing steady. The woman beside you hadn't moved, but the seat next to hers was now occupied by a man, tall, thin, wearing a dark hat that obscured his features. His head was tilted down, but you could see his fingers twitching, tapping lightly on the armrest. David, the voice again. This time, you were sure it came from him. You swallowed, your throat dry. Who's there? You asked in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. You regretted it immediately, feeling foolish. No one was going to answer you. The passengers were all silent. There was nothing but the low hum of the bus and the occasional shudder of the rain beating against the windows. But then, the man spoke. Not long now, he said softly, his voice like sandpaper scraping against your nerves. You didn't know what to say. Your heart was pounding in your chest. It was just a bus ride, right? Just another boring ride to nowhere. But the air inside this bus felt suffocating, like it was closing in on you. The man didn't move. He didn't turn his head. He just sat there, as if he had been waiting for something, as if you had been waiting for something. The bus passed through the city's streets, but something was off. The scenery outside was changing subtly, almost imperceptibly. The familiar streetlights turned into dim, flickering bulbs. The buildings, once brightly lit, were now dark, abandoned shells of what they once were. The night outside seemed darker, the shadows growing longer. You glanced at the driver. He was still silent, his hands gripping the wheel like his life depended on it. You could see his reflection in the mirror, but his eyes, those eyes, were empty. No, not empty. They were lost. Then, as if on cue, the bus made a sharp turn, cutting through an alleyway you'd never seen before. The road was narrow, winding, and lined with tall trees that seemed to close in on both sides. The windows fogged up, distorting the view, and the bus headlights flickered once more before dimming altogether. The rain beat harder against the windows, turning into a steady drum that filled the silence in a way that was unnervingly loud. You tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping up your spine. You were probably just overthinking it. After all, it was just a bus ride. But then, you noticed something you hadn't seen before. The bus was no longer following the usual route. You stared out the window, your heart sinking. The street signs were unfamiliar. The streets were deserted. There were no other cars, no people walking, just empty, desolate streets stretching into the blackness. You swallowed hard, staring at the road ahead. "Where are we?" you murmured aloud. No one answered. The silence in the bus deepened, and you could hear the faint sound of your own heartbeat in your ears. Suddenly, the man beside you leaned in closer, his voice now a low whisper. "You can't get off." His words sent a jolt through your body. You turned to face him, but his face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat. His shoulders were hunched, and his hands were twitching again, like he was holding something in them. "What do you mean?" you asked, your voice trembling despite your best efforts to remain calm. He didn't respond right away. For a moment, you thought he hadn't heard you, but then, he leaned closer, his face just inches from yours. You could feel his breath, cold and damp against your skin. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered. "None of us are." You jerked away from him, feeling a chill creep up your spine. You had to get off. You had to get off the bus. But as if on cue, the bus began to slow, pulling into a stop that shouldn't have existed. The lights outside had dimmed completely. The bus came to a halt with a heavy sigh, and you could feel the air inside grow even colder. The doors opened with a hiss, and for the first time since you boarded, you felt the weight of the silence around you. No one moved. Not the passengers, not the driver, not even the man next to you. The only thing you could hear now was the rain, still falling relentlessly, washing away any trace of the outside world. And then, the voice returned. "Get off the bus." You didn't know where you were anymore. You didn't know if you even wanted to know, but the urge to leave the bus, to get away from whatever this place was, became almost unbearable. Before you could make a move, something stopped you. You felt the cold weight of the air press down on your chest, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. The door stayed open, but something told you it wasn't just the rain you'd be walking into. A heavy weight settled over the bus. It felt wrong, terribly wrong. And then, slowly, you turned to face the driver. His eyes were on you, empty. But now, they were different. They weren't just empty anymore. They were hollow. And as you locked eyes with him, he whispered, "You can never leave." The doors of the bus were still open, but you couldn't bring yourself to move. A cold weight pressed down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an overwhelming silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. The driver's hollow eyes were locked onto yours, and you could feel something creeping under your skin, as if his gaze was peeling away layers of your soul. "You can never leave." The words echoed in your mind, reverberating with a coldness that chilled you to the bone. You wanted to scream, to run, but your body refused to obey. It was like you were paralyzed, trapped in some unseen force that you couldn't fight. The passengers, who had been so still before, were now watching you, their eyes gleaming with something unnatural, something predatory. You forced yourself to look away from the driver, focusing instead on the dark, wet street outside. The street lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows along the road. The rain was heavier now, a torrential downpour that blurred everything beyond the bus's windows. And yet, something about the darkness felt wrong. It wasn't just the storm, it was the way the shadows seemed to move, as if they were alive, crawling along the pavement like 1,000 dark fingers, stretching toward you. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, clearer, and it carried an edge of desperation. "Get off the bus." You turned your head slowly, your pulse quickening. The man next to you, the one in the dark coat, was now staring at you intently, his face just inches from yours. His eyes were wide, empty, but there was something in them now, something, pleading. "You have to get off," he repeated, his voice shaky, "before it's too late." His words hung in the air, thick with urgency. You tried to speak, but no sound came out. The lump in your throat had grown so tight that it felt like you couldn't breathe. The man's hand reached out toward you, trembling, but you could see it now. Two of his fingers were shaking uncontrollably. They weren't just shaking from fear. They were twitching as if they were trying to pull themselves free from something that was pulling them in. Before you could react, the lights inside the bus flickered again, and the temperature dropped sharply. A strange static filled the air, like the bus had just crossed some unseen boundary. You felt it, too, a shift, as if the world outside had changed. You looked out the window. The street was gone. There was no longer a road, no sidewalk, no buildings, just an endless expanse of blackness, stretching out in all directions. The rain, too, had stopped. The world outside had gone utterly still. It was as if the bus was no longer on the same plane of existence. You were somewhere else, somewhere that didn't exist on any map, somewhere. The man's face twisted in agony as he reached for you again, but this time, something seemed to pull him back, something invisible, but strong, like a rope tied around his chest. His body jerked back in his seat as though the very air was fighting against him. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and then, a loud crack echoed through the bus. You turned to see the woman next to you, the one who had been sitting motionless before, now leaning forward. Her face contorted in pain, her skin had turned ashen, and her eyes were wide open, staring into nothing. The whispering returned, but it wasn't just one voice now. It was a chorus, rising in volume until it drowned out everything else. "Get off the bus." Her mouth opened, but it wasn't words that came out. It was a guttural sound, low and unnatural, like something trying to claw its way out of her throat. The air in the bus grew thick, as if the very atmosphere had turned heavy with dread. The temperature plummeted even further, the chill cutting into your bones. The other passengers were beginning to move now, slowly, but surely. They all started to stir. Their movements were jerky, as if they were no longer fully in control of their bodies. One by one, they turned to face you, their eyes blank, their mouths hanging open in a soundless scream. Then, the bus lurched forward with a violent jerk. The sudden motion sent you sliding across your seat, and you grabbed onto the armrest, heart racing. It wasn't the sound of tires on wet pavement anymore. It was something different. The wheels were no longer turning on a road. The bus was no longer moving on the earth. You were moving through something else, something far more ancient. The air thickened again, and the shadows outside grew darker, more oppressive. You could see shapes moving in the darkness, tall, shadowy figures that seemed to follow the bus, their forms stretching and warping in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Panic gripped you. You had to get off. You had to get out of here. But as you turned to look toward the door, something else caught your eye. The driver. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing. But his body wasn't right. His legs were too long, his arms too thin, and his face was a mask of nothingness, a dark void where his features should have been. The hollow, empty eyes were now black, solid black. And then, the voice returned. "You can't leave." The words hit you like a wave. They pressed against your chest, squeezing the air from your lungs. You tried to scream, but no sound came out. Your body was paralyzed, frozen in place. You were trapped, and the only thing you could do was watch as the shadows outside closed in around you. The bus was no longer moving on a road. It was falling through space, through an endless void. You couldn't tell where you were anymore. You didn't know if you were alive or dead. But one thing was certain, you weren't getting off. The air inside the bus had become suffocating. The oppressive weight of it crushed down on you, making it difficult to think, breathe. The walls of the bus felt as though they were shrinking, the space growing smaller with each breath. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, creeping into the bus like something alive, stretching toward you. The driver, if you could still call him that, was standing now. His long, unnaturally thin arms hung at his sides, his body swaying slightly. His face, there was nothing there anymore, only a dark, empty void where his features should have been. You couldn't bear to look at him any longer. His presence felt like a cold force pulling at your very soul. The passengers around you had changed. They were still staring at you, their faces blank, their movements slow, unnatural. There was a heaviness in the air, a strange stillness, as though the world outside had paused. Time itself had frozen. The bus lurched forward, but the motion felt wrong. It wasn't like the normal bumps of a ride, it was more like the bus was being dragged, as if the road beneath it had disappeared entirely. The windows fogged up, and through the mist, you could see the world outside shifting. It wasn't the city anymore. The streets were gone, the buildings, the lights, the signs all disappeared into an endless, oppressive darkness. "It's too late," the driver's voice echoed, low and hollow, like the words were coming from everywhere at once. The air grew thick with an uncomfortable stillness. The world outside, now just an inky black void, seemed to be closing in. The passengers were no longer just still, they seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for you. There was a strange, undeniable pull. The door of the bus opened by itself, and outside, there was nothing but emptiness, a dark, endless expanse. The air felt colder than before, and a distant, unsettling sound echoed from beyond the threshold, like whispers calling you into the unknown. You stood up, your feet heavy as you shuffled toward the door. A sense of dread gripped you, but you couldn't stop yourself. The darkness outside seemed to call to you, promising answers, or perhaps more questions. You didn't know what would happen if you stayed. You didn't know what was waiting for you outside, but you had to know. As you stepped off the bus, the door slammed shut behind you, cutting you off from whatever had been inside. You looked around, but the world you had entered didn't feel like reality. It was like a dream, no, worse than a dream, a place that existed outside of time and space. There were no roads, no signs, no landmarks, just an endless stretch of dark, desolate land, stretching on forever. The bus was gone. You turned back toward the direction you came from, but all you could see was the empty road, fading into the darkness. The air around you was heavy, cold, and the feeling of being watched crept over you. Something was there, something that had been waiting. And then, from behind, you heard the voice again, low, almost imperceptible. "You can never leave." But this time, the voice wasn't just coming from the air. It was coming from everywhere. The ground beneath you seemed to shift, the shadows curling at the edges of your vision, trying to reach out, to pull you back. You couldn't escape this place. No one could. And the darkness, it was closing in. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts on this terrifying story, and subscribe for more spine-chilling horror tales.